On Lectures in History, Providence College professor Jeffrey Johnson teaches a class about the 1916 bombing of a parade in San Francisco that killed 10 and wounded 40. The bombing took place on what was called Preparedness Day, organized by pro-business groups to keep people vigilant in case the U.S. entered World War I. The attack remains the worst act of terrorism in San Francisco history. His class is about 50 minutes.
Well, good morning. Thanks for coming. I appreciate you all being here on a drizzly day at Providence College. Today I wanted to share with you, I think, a story and a moment in American history that is one of the, for me, more important moments of the late 19th and the early 20th century. It holds a lot of significance in this period of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. It also happens to be the subject of my new book, and so I've been kind of living and breathing in this period and in this moment, which again I think just is very, very significant for 1916 and really for the nation, as I think I'll try to make clear. So what I'll do today is kind of start by setting up the context of San Francisco in 1916 during this moment, during this summer. And then I'll spend some time in really three parts, kind of talking about why it's significant and why it's important to American history and our story. But let me begin by kind of framing this story about this 1916 moment. Many of you have probably seen this character before, Mark Twain, of course, the famous American playwright, and he had many quips during his life, but one of them that he said is, "The coldest winter I ever spent was a summer in San Francisco." This is one of his jokes. Of course, if you've ever been to San Francisco, you know this sometimes to be true. He had said this reportedly about the Bay City. July 1916, though, seemed a little different. The air was pretty mild. The summer weather had turned very fair and pleasant. The local weather forecaster by the name of T.R. Reed, who wrote for the San Francisco Chronicle, predicted only a light wind for July 22nd, 1916. So it had settled into a very pleasant summer. And there was a great deal of excitement surrounding the city that July for lots of reasons. But San Francisco, in many ways, was a far cry from the city that it had been with the famous San Francisco earthquake a decade earlier. This was a famous moment in 1906 that many of you have probably heard of. And the city had kind of rebuilt itself since 1906 and in the previous decade. In fact, so much so that the city had just had a World's Fair and hosted one in 1915 as a kind of celebration of this revitalized city. And there were lots of other things happening in the city. You can see here this gentleman. This is Charles Evans Hughes. He was a judge who was also running for president in 1916. So he came to San Francisco and he promised Republican Party kind of loyalists that he would win by an overwhelming majority. His words. If you've not heard of President Hughes, that's probably because he didn't win by an overwhelming majority. But he visited the city that summer as part of his campaign. Another moment that happened around this weekend of July 22nd is that the new Alaska Steamship Line, which was a brand new shipping line, announced new service from San Francisco to New York, for the first time utilizing the new and innovative Panama Canal. So this was a city that had really arrived, had these kind of famous moments happening. And if you took a quick glance at San Francisco in 1915 and 1916, it seemed like a city that had revitalized and seemed very much on the scene. The economy was strong. The city had all kinds of sort of previous histories as a labor city that had had a little bit of ferment, a little bit of unrest, except by this point, the city seemed at relative peace, while, as you know, the rest of the world was at war. Well, on the morning of July 22nd, 1916, if we can kind of talk just about this Saturday, there was a woman by the name of Mrs. Cecil Wymore, who was a young mother from Oakland, California. And she made her way across the bay from Oakland to San Francisco that day and that morning. She took the journey with her husband, Lloyd, and her two young children, Virginia, age 4, and Billy, age 2. They left their 53rd Avenue home in Oakland to go across the bay to San Francisco, really in a trip that was about the children. They were going to San Francisco so that they could marvel in the spectacle of the city's much anticipated Preparedness Day parade. By this point, as many of you know, of course, if this is 1916, by 1914 in Europe, war had been raging. World War I was very much underway. And the United States, with involvement in the war a real possibility, started to have parades like this as a show of kind of patriotism and maybe for the possibility of entering the war, to show enthusiasm for the possibility of World War I. Newspaper accounts for the parade when they traveled downtown had estimated that about 50,000 people would show up and witness this parade, including the Wymore family. And it seemed to kind of symbolize this harmonious moment of patriotism in San Francisco, perhaps. People could also buy along Market Street, a famous street in downtown San Francisco, in fact, where the parade would go up. They could buy at local markets and shops and so on flags and buttons and banners and these kinds of things to demonstrate their patriotism. The San Francisco Chronicle, as people prepared and bought all of these things, even published the parade route. It was going to go up Market Street from the famous Ferry Building, which was is still an iconic building in San Francisco, and then it would turn west onto Van Ness Street. So there was a lot of anticipation about the parade in San Francisco, and it's no wonder that this family went downtown. Well, when the parade began and when it started, here's a shot of what the parade looked like. This is Market Street, so you get a sense here of what this may have looked like. The official count said that there were 51,319 people in attendance to see this parade. Again, this kind of patriotic World War I parade. 52 bands participated, and about 2,134 different groups. As you see here, soldiers, National Guard, many of them veterans from the Spanish-American War, nurses groups, Boy Scouts, you name it. Curiously, though, no labor groups, no unions, no working class folks. They purposely chose to boycott the event, to kind of send a message about what this display might have meant to them. Well, one Oregon newspaper called the San Francisco Preparedness Day Parade the greatest demonstration in support of a national movement that the West had ever seen. So here was this huge outpouring for this moment. Well, once in the city, the Wymores grabbed a spot along Market Street, all four of them. By this point, as you see here, jammed shoulder to shoulder with these 50,000 plus onlookers. Well, what happened next, just after 2 p.m., about a half an hour into the parade, the local press would deem one of the most pathetic results of the explosion and of the parade. As she held Billy up in her arms, Mrs. Wymore had him up to get a better look at the parade, a bomb exploded. And it instantly took off both of her legs, this young 26-year-old mother. Surgeons quickly scrambled to help Mrs. Wymore, but the wounds, as you would imagine, proved fatal. Dazed from the shock, her husband Lloyd stumbled away, very kind of upset, of course, understandably by all of this. And the two children miraculously survived the attack. So it was an overwhelmingly kind of festive and sunny day that had turned inexplicably dark. Well, the blast ultimately will kill 10 parade goers that day, including, of course, Mrs. Wymore. And shrapnel would wound about another 40 people that had been witnessing the parade. So the tragedy, I think, that struck the Wymore family and many others at 2:06 p.m. on July 22nd, 1916, stands as an underappreciated and yet critical point in American history. Taken on the whole, I think it marked 30 years kind of bookends of trouble between capital and labor. It also showed how the nation might respond to such an unsettling event, particularly how a nation might deal with discontented labor, critics of the war, immigrants in the country, just how the U.S. might just handle a high point, I think, of wartime dissent and division. So this was a decisive event for one summer, and perhaps longer, that turned the nation's attention on San Francisco and the nation as we teetered on the edge of war. So we know a lot about labor violence And we know a lot about conflict during the Gilded Age and Progressive Era for sure. But I tell this story in some ways because I think it matters in the broader context of American history, particularly in the early 20th century. What it gets us to think about, perhaps, is how war and anti-radicalism seem to intertwine during a time of dissent. So I want to talk about why this matters really in three parts today. And take this why more story and this real tragedy and how we might kind of make sense of it. And I'll give you a few reasons or frameworks for how I'll talk about this. The first theme, I think, and why this is so important, is that it revealed, for sure, a division between labor and capital. And, as you see here, also a reaction to the government, particularly dissent during World War I. That is, objections to the war. Secondly, the aftermath of the parade and the bombing also revealed some very serious and stark anti-immigrant attitudes. Sometimes they would be rolled into anti-radical attitudes as well. But during a time of war, the nation really had to kind of grapple with radicalism and that segment of the population. And finally, as you'll see, it also revealed and kind of uncovered a problematic criminal justice system. Certainly, as many people were very nervous and fearful of radicalism gone awry in this country. So let me take up that first point and kind of talk about this relationship between capital and labor and this reaction to the government and criticism of war as this patriotism, at least superficially, seemed to take root. San Francisco is an interesting kind of labor city. I've got a picture here. This is, of course, more than a decade before the bombing, but these are dock workers in San Francisco. And San Francisco, in many ways, replicated or paralleled the way that labor kind of functioned in the country at the time. You could expect, if you were a worker in the early 20th century, to work long days for low wages and often in dangerous conditions, depending on your occupation. So this was a real time of reform and activism by unions and others to bring greater rights, fairer wages, safer working conditions, all of those things to workers. San Francisco was very much a part of that. Now, it was notoriously a closed shop town, much to the chagrin of business interests. And what that meant was that you had to be a member of a union, right, as a condition of employment, right? So lots of folks, business interests in the city, kind of hoped for the opposite. They would have hoped that San Francisco would have been an open shop town, right? Because it really demonstrated the power of unions. So unions were really important to San Francisco, no question about it. And in fact, labor had flexed its muscles a number of times in San Francisco. There had been a number of famous strikes. There was a streetcar strike against the United Railroads around 1907. There was another one against the Pacific Gas Company in 1913. And so, union activism was a tradition in San Francisco as it was elsewhere. But certainly, this bombing and this connection to labor seemed to be one that was apparent. It seemed to be an important connection. And authorities would wonder just how, but it certainly mattered in some ways for sure. This dastardly act, as it was called in the press, many people started to suspect might have just ties to labor and particularly radical laborers, right? The people who had been on the front lines of these strikes and activities and all of those kinds of things. So this was part of this longer American history since Chicago and Haymarket in the 1880s of this tenuous relationship. And these fights in San Francisco and across the country had played out in newspapers, in mines, in a number of places. The ballot box, and sometimes, as you saw, the streets. And so this was a tenuous relationship, and the country seemed, particularly because of capital and labor and workers and business interests, very much at odds. I think that's safe to say. The other thing I'll tell you about San Francisco in 1916, and this image maybe doesn't have a lot to do with it because we just don't have a lot of images of these groups, but you should also know, for maybe obvious reasons, that there was a very vibrant and very, very alive anarchist community in San Francisco as well. So you kind of had these labor forces, and then you also had anarchists in the city. They were holding meetings. They were advertising in local newspapers. You could come to their meetings if you want. Many of them held in German or Italian because many of the anarchists who came to the country were immigrants. They had newspapers, and they were often high-profile groups in San Francisco. One of them was called Volonta, V-O-L-O-N-T-A. And so people knew about it in a way that probably we wouldn't identify with anarchism in a very public way now. In San Francisco, it was different in 1916. These were very public and active groups. Okay? So you have this kind of anarchist element as well. Let me just say one more thing about it. You have maybe conceptions about anarchism as bomb throwers and so on. These were folks that since the days of the French Revolution, which you've learned about in your other classes, were very interested and concerned about despotic state power, right? And so they were interested in governments that had too much power. So it was really an ideology that was reacting to that. And there were certain anarchists who believed in something called propaganda by the deed, or propaganda of the deed, depending on how you translated it from the French. Meaning that if you have one specific kind of attack, it could prove a kind of spark, right, against the state, inspire other radicals, and so on. So you saw with this parade, maybe, right, this was kind of a moment of one of these deeds, perhaps. So if we're still kind of talking about labor and capital and dissent during the war, you should also know that World War I is happening. Of course, it breaks out in 1914. The United States doesn't get involved in World War I until 1917. So it's a war that had been a long and bloody fight in Europe, and the United States had not participated. You should know that this broader American movement of preparedness, though, gained a lot of traction. It gained a lot of steam. In other words, the thinking was, and if you looked at the Lusitania sinking, and there were other kind of world events that seems to demonstrate the way the Germans, for example, were using unrestricted submarine warfare, it's possible that the United States might get drawn into this war. So the United States, and many leaders in particular, started to have the attitude that we better be ready for war. The size of the U.S. Army was woefully behind, so we needed a bigger army and we needed a better equipped army as well, just in case war happens. And there were lots of national figures who kind of led the fight for preparedness, which becomes this movement, preparedness, right? This was a Preparedness Day parade. Teddy Roosevelt, Elihu Root, Woodrow Wilson. So you had all these kind of figures, former secretaries of war, former generals, and so on, saying, we are way behind militarily, and if this war drags the United States in, we better be ready, right? So we better be prepared, right? So this notion of preparedness catches on, for sure. Parades like the one we started with today, and the focus for today in San Francisco, was a phenomenon that happened all over. In other words, how local communities demonstrated their preparedness was part of this exercise. In other words, having a parade that might demonstrate that community's patriotism and sort of fervor for the war. And I'll give you a few examples. This is the Preparedness Day parade that happens in Washington, D.C. Obviously, you can see the Capitol maybe in the far distance there, so you can make some sense of that. But these happened all over, particularly in the summer of 1916. Kansas City has a Preparedness Day parade. Seattle has a Preparedness Day parade. Okay? The biggest one up to this point, though, as you might imagine, was in Washington, D.C., and you can see it playing out here. Let me just say a couple things about it. It happened on June 14th, 1916, so a little over a month before the one in San Francisco. This was an estimated crowd of about 60,000 men, women, and children. Papers billed it the most remarkable patriotic spectacle in the Capitol we've ever seen. And you can kind of get a sense of this patriotism being displayed. The President of the United States, by his order, closed all of the federal offices that day so folks could attend. So in the parade, you had members of Congress, you had women's suffrage advocates marching, you had Boy Scouts, you had all kinds of dignitaries participating. And again, the president at the time hoped that this would happen. At the front of the parade was President Woodrow Wilson. Now, this is him after he had kind of led the parade, because then he goes to a viewing stand and then the parade could kind of come by. But he marched in front of the parade, kind of sauntering at the front. He had a big straw hat on. He had an American flag over his shoulder. And everybody was kind of cheering in the crowd and so on. And eventually he made his way to this grandstand to review the parade at the end. At one point, there were a bunch of handlers who released several hundred carrier pigeons into the air to in their words, send the message of preparedness all over the Capitol. They probably sent a lot more all over the Capitol too, but these pigeons were sent out as this kind of display, perhaps, of patriotism and so on. So preparedness, I hope I'm convincing you, is alive and well. It's a really important moment. World War I is looming, and how the United States might handle that is interesting. Well, part of the preparedness cycle was the fact that it wasn't a unanimous amount of support for preparedness. In other words, not everybody was on board for preparedness, that's for sure. And in fact, there was great criticism about World War I from lots of different forces. As you might imagine, criticism particularly comes of World War I from people that were among the labor class, working class Americans, right, and also people on the American left, right, politically left. Socialists, right, certainly anarchists and others would have been really opposed to the war for lots of reasons. And if you've read any Marx for any of your classes and so on, you know, of course, that all wars are capitalist wars, right? And who benefits from wars, right? Financiers and those that are running the war operations and so on. Randolph Bourne was a famous social critic at the time. He said this mantra that war is the health of the state. He was a critic of the war, right? So who benefits, right? Certainly not the rank and file American workers who would be doing the fighting, right? Well, the real divisive issue about the war was certainly surrounding whether or not the U.S. should get involved in the war, but it was really about conscription. It was about a draft. We didn't have a draft in the United States. But there was a Selective Service Act that started to get debated and eventually was signed into law in 1917. Because remember, our army is woefully small, right? So it means, right, and those of you that are young men in this class know when you turn 18, you get that selective service card, right, and you have to register for the draft. If you don't, it's a crime, right? So we begin to see that process here, and there were many critics outspoken about just who would be doing the fighting. Rank and file, average Americans, right? Certainly not the kinds of people with means. So there was this kind of labor and leftist objections, of course, to the war generally, but especially to conscription, especially to a draft and the idea of a draft. So all throughout the United States, there was a kind of healthy dissent about war and the U.S. involvement and so on, and San Francisco was no different. In fact, on July 20th, just 2 days before the bombing, at the Dreamland Rink, which is the Fillmore, there was about 4,000 Unionists and war critics who showed up. This is 2 days before the bombing, right, in San Francisco. They show up at this venue to express their discontent about the possibility of war. And I'll give you another example. On the very night of the bombing, it didn't happen, but Emma Goldman, who was a famous, and that's a name that maybe might mean something to some of you, a famous American anarchist, was in San Francisco when the bombing happened, and that night, as you can see from this slide, she was to give a lecture. And so for 25 cents, you could go and hear Emma Goldman, this kind of famous anarchist, this famous radical of note. She was going to give this address, again, for 25 cents. The title of her talk, as you see here, doesn't mince any words. Can you see that? I'm not sure if you can see that, but it says, "Preparedness, the road to universal slaughter." So it's making very clear what she thinks about preparedness and the possibility of what the draft and conscription will mean. Universal slaughter, right? So Goldman was in town during the attack. Let me share with you, too, one other ominous warning. So that was to happen the night of the bombing. Before the bombing, in the few days before, the newspaper editors in San Francisco all got an ominous letter. The police chief did as well. And I want to read to you this warning letter that was sent to these editors because I think it's an important message. Again, this was a few days. They get this in the mail at the local newspaper offices before the bombing. Editors, our protests have been in vain in regards to this preparedness propaganda, so we're going to use a little direct action on the 22nd, which will echo around the earth and show that Frisco really knows how, and that militarism cannot be forced on us and our children without a violent protest. Things are going to happen to show that we will go to any extreme, the same as the controlling classes, to preserve what little democracy we still have. We don't take this as a joke, and you shouldn't, or be truly awakened. Awaken! we are sworn to our duty of the masses and only send warnings to those who are wise, but who are forced to march to hold their jobs, as we want to give only the hypocritical patriots who shout for war, but never go to war, a real taste of war. Right? So if you read that statement, and you think about it, it's an ominous warning, and it's playing, right, on the fact that these are people who are shouting for war very patriotically, but at the end of the day, these aren't the people who will do the fighting in the war, right? So nobody knows where this ominous warning comes from, but it's delivered to these newspaper offices and the chief of police. Well, of course, as we talked about at the beginning of today, true to their word, whoever wrote this, or someone associated with that, in fact, held up their end of the bargain, right? And did the deed as we know. So that's kind of the first part of, I think, in kind of thinking about this and why it matters. It matters in terms of World War I and dissent and capital and labor and these kind of ominous warning signs. And actually, if you looked at that and you listened very carefully to that letter, it talks about the working classes and the ruling classes. So it kind of speaks to that divide that seems so endemic in the late 19th and the early 20th century. Well, let me talk second for a moment about how this mattered in terms of anti-immigrant, especially, and also anti-labor attitudes. Because after the bombing, right, the manhunt is immediately underway. And it revealed a couple things. One, it was very clear that the powers that be in the city were interested in striking a blow at radical labor. In other words, cracking down on labor, right? Using this as an opportunity, right, against the closed shop, for example, and against labor elements that had been so strong in the city. And the other thing, and I'll give you a couple examples of this in just a second, is there was also a very much a vibrant anti-immigrant attitude, because those things seem to go hand in hand. The condemnation, of course, as you would imagine, came very quickly from the press. This was a very dastardly act, as we know. The Los Angeles Herald called it a diabolical crime in San Francisco, and it has disturbed the equilibrium of the entire state of California, they said. The authorities acted quickly, claiming that they would find, and these are their words, the swarthy man responsible, and that seemed to have these kinds of undertones about who might have been responsible for this. And they really started to focus their emphasis for the perpetrator on what they would have called lodging houses. They were really kind of like single occupancy hotels, places where transient immigrant workers often might have moved through, sometimes quickly, San Francisco. So this is where they were focusing their energy. So if you listen to that clearly, right, whoever committed this dastardly act was somebody who was swarthy, living in these transient, often immigrant housing situations, often the poorer parts of the city and so on. So it was clear that it was targeted at a particular community, for sure. Residents were told in San Francisco to remain vigilant as the manhunt was underway. A very agreeable press, of course, continued to talk in those terms and said that the authorities would get what they called a fanatic demon responsible for this, a fanatic demon. Almost immediately, of course, blame fell on what were perceived as radicals. The San Francisco mayor, James Rolfe, declared all agitators will be driven from the city. Again, so this anti-labor, anti-radical idea. One paper didn't hesitate to specify the source of the attack. Quote, the IWW, anarchists, and socialists have been very strong in denouncing the Preparedness campaign, and some of these people are no doubt responsible for this dastardly act, the paper said. Well, there was one Finnish immigrant in line with this kind of anti-immigrant attitude. His name was Frank Josephson, who got arrested by the police. He was in a boarding house, a sailor's boarding house that he lived in. It was on Drum Street. All he could do, according to the newspaper accounts, is kind of exclaim, I didn't do it, I didn't do it. And he sort of said that over and over again. And he sat in the police station trembling and so on. And the newspapers, when Josephson was arrested and even before, had explicitly said that whoever committed the crime, right, clearly this was, quote, the act of some foreigner. The act of some foreigner. So it's no surprise that somebody like Josephson, this Finnish immigrant, would be nabbed and then arrested and blamed. Thankfully for Josephson, he was very nervous and scared and all these kinds of things. The police admitted that they had no connections between him and the bombing and they let him go. But I think it spoke to this attitude. In other words, we know who did this. It was clearly an immigrant. Also implicated, and I'll just mention this quickly, were two other people who were in San Francisco at the time of the attack. One of them is this guy, Alexander Berkman. If that's a name that means anything to you, he had tried to assassinate Henry Clay Frick, the famous kind of Pittsburgh steel mogul, in the 1890s. He goes to jail for this assassination attempt for over a decade. Berkman was very proud of this. He labeled it the first terrorist act in American history. He doesn't actually kill Frick, but he tries, and he stabs him, but Frick survives. But Berkman was living in San Francisco in 1916. He's an immigrant. He's Jewish. He is a radical. He's an anarchist. So he's very much in line with these kinds of attitudes. He also publishes, and I think you will catch the subtlety of the headline of the newspaper. This is the masthead. He publishes a newspaper titled The Blast, which of course is an anarchist newspaper. So he's immediately catching some suspicion. With him was his friend and on-again, off-again lover, by the way, Emma Goldman, the same woman who was going to give that Preparedness, the Road to Universal Slaughter speech. So she's around San Francisco at the time as well, and they were very much in cahoots. And just to give you one example of kind of the anti-immigrant attitudes about Berkman and Goldman, who were both Jewish, they were described as the kind of people who pop up at any radical movement that promises financial returns. And also newspapers spoke of their, quote, money-grabbing proclivities. In other words, right, this is a stereotype about Jewish people somehow that they're just trying to profit from radicalism, right? Again, anti-immigrant, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic stuff here, for sure. So I think that kind of anti-immigrant, anti-labor force is certainly important. Let me finish with my third kind of why this matters idea. And that's this kind of anti-radicalism and this climate, in some ways, of the Red Scare and this broader kind of miscarriage of justice, which I think you'll find interesting as well. The district attorney was a guy by the name of Charles Fickert. He was a former football player, this big hulking fellow. He had his own kind of political ambitions. Moved very quickly. He said, quote, in the interest of justice. So he was very interested in making quick arrests and finding the culprits very quickly. And he's doing this in less than scrupulous ways, quick arrests without warrants, these kinds of things to bring someone to justice. It was also clear that Fickert, the district attorney, wanted to strike a blow against radical labor. And so this was part of his mission. He was working in cahoots with another guy by the name of Martin Swanson, who was a former Pinkerton detective. If you know anything about the Pinkertons, right? They were this kind of, before we had large bureaus of investigation and so on, but they were this kind of auxiliary hired police force that lots of companies and others, if you know the story of the Molly Maguires, for example, you kind of know the Pinkertons and their stories. So Swanson was a former Pinkerton man who had worked against San Francisco labor elements during earlier strikes. So he's brought in by the district attorney. The district attorney asks him, I need a list of all the labor agitators who were in town on July 22nd, 1916, right? The day of the bombing. And that will be our list. So Swanson draws up his kind of list of all the people that had given him trouble in the past. And of the list, there were 5 people who were former labor organizers or still labor organizers or deemed radicals who were in town on July 22nd, 1916. And that's who they arrested. The group is as pictured here. They're brought into the police station. They're identified as the 5 suspects. And again, brought in purely because of that list drawn up by Swanson. Warren Billings, who you can kind of see second from the left there, was arrested. He was 22 years old, very young, very active in the shoemakers union, so he was an active union guy. You had Edward Nolan on the far right there, also active in the machinists union, so he was a labor organizer as well. Israel Weinberg on the far left, who was a bus driver, and involved in some of those earlier strikes for jitney car drivers and so on. You can see here in the bus operators union. Okay? So these were all young and active labor organizers. But of most interest to Swanson and Fickert were in the center here, Tom Mooney and Rena Mooney, as you see pictured here. Particularly the young Tom Mooney. Young, I don't know, he was 33. That still seems kind of young to me. But Tom Mooney was a noted kind of radical agitator in San Francisco, had been involved in a number of strikes, lots of organizing in those previous altercations and so on. He had been a socialist, depends on how you might define that, but he had traveled with Eugene Debs at one point, the famous kind of perennial socialist candidate for president, aboard the Red Special, which was the train that took Debs all over the country. So Mooney was an active labor organizer, certainly on the political left, no question about it. But he catches the real eye of the authorities, and his wife Rena as well, who was active in organizing with him. She spent her days as a music teacher. She had a music studio in San Francisco. The authorities would call it a den, which makes it sound more ominous, but she had a couple pianos and she had music students. And so Mooney and his wife, but especially Mooney, really attracted the attention of the authorities. When they were arrested, they were held in solitary confinement. They weren't allowed to talk to family or friends or legal counsel. And the assistant DA told a local reporter that the suspects, quote, ought to be hung without ceremony. In other words, let's do this quick and let's have a fast conviction. On August 2nd, 1916, they were jointly charged with murder. And this became an interesting part of kind of the legal story. But the authorities kind of considered them all part of the same conspiracy. So when one was tried, evidence would be used against the other one and so on. It was very complex, right? And probably a little unfair. Well, I'll just tell you, as the investigation got underway, there was some problematic police work. There were macabre souvenir hunters who, after the bombing, showed up, and the bomb had been constructed so it had bullets in it, as well as pieces of metal and so on. That's intended to be projectiles and so on. They found a woman's watch hundreds of yards away from the blast. So it was a really powerful bomb, but with all these kinds of pieces of shrapnel and so on. So souvenir hunters kind of took this stuff as something. But of course that matters for the police work. The other problem with the police work as well, complicating things, you can see the whole blast here, is that the authorities came and they washed away all the dust and all the soot and all that kind of stuff, which of course for police work is also a little bit of a problem in terms of finding valuable evidence and so on. The story of this and the trials that began in 1916 and 1917 are a very long and complex story that I could talk about with you more. But you should know that during the course of these legal proceedings, and this is pretty well documented, it's not hard to dispute, there were doctored photographs, there was perjured testimony, meaning people lied under oath, and there were all kinds of other incriminating elements to the prosecution's case. And Mooney and Billings, in particular, will both be convicted. Billings convicted in December of 1916. Mooney convicted February of 1917. So those are important dates to remember. 1916, 1917, these guys go to jail. Now, if you think about this, they're not going to have a very sympathetic public. This is in the age of the Red Scare. The Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, gets his front porch blown up by a bomb. And of course, radicals are now hunted in the United States and so on. We get the Espionage Act and we get the Sedition Act as well, as you know, which limit disloyal speech, which of course is open to interpretation. Also, you couldn't mail socialist and other critical kind of pieces of writing in newspapers and those kinds of things. So things like the International Socialist Review and so on just stop being mailed. The Blast as well, Berkman's paper, you just can't mail those things anymore because the government cracks down on all that stuff by 1917 or 1918. There is, as you can imagine, a long series of appeals for their fight. So they go to jail 1916 and 1917. The fight, the legal fight, lasts over 20 years. A series of governors review the case each time they kind of come into office. And each time they kind of all realize that it's a political hot potato. And they refuse to give Mooney a new trial. And they refuse to exonerate him, to give him a pardon. President Wilson, Woodrow Wilson, even commissioned a special organization, it became known as the Wilson Commission, to investigate the case and come to some conclusions. And their conclusions were basically that there had been some funny business with this trial, with some of these photos and some of the testimony and so on. And since 1917, it always seemed to come out more and more revelations about so-and-so had told this story on the stand, that wasn't true. This happened with the evidence, that wasn't true. So there started to be more and more kind of revelations. In the meantime, Mooney became this kind of cause celeb. He became very famous as this martyr for American labor. He became a public figure. There was a huge defense fund, and there's this continual fight made on his behalf for his exoneration. But remember, this is a process that lasts 20 plus years. It wasn't until the morning hours of January 7th, 1939. Let me say that again. January 7th, 1939. Remember, they went to jail in 1916 and 1917, right? That Mooney, now 56 years old, is visited by the governor. And Mooney is taken to Sacramento. The new governor was a guy by the name of Culbert Olson. It was broadcast nationally on the radio, and he says, the governor says, "I've signed and now hand to you, Tom Mooney, this final and unconditional pardon." And the crowd rang out. And Mooney, by the way, understood that this was a fight for democracy and justice, and he was sort of grinning when this happened, and he was able to make a statement. And he kind of framed it in the kind of context of decay in the world, and he was kind of thinking about what was happening in Germany at the time and how much justice really mattered. But just to put this again in perspective, this is Mooney when he gets out of jail. And that was Mooney when he went in. So I think those are powerful photos. Well, let me finish with this. I think that we know that this is a gross misappropriation of justice. It is pretty clear that this was a wrongful conviction. And having looked at the evidence, it's not very definitive at all that Mooney had anything to do with it. In fact, he probably had nothing to do with it. And I'll say more about that in just a second. Some have made lots of inferences about the kind of whodunit question. In other words, who did the attack? Who did the bombing? There's one name bandied about, a guy by the name of Selston Eklund, who was a famous kind of San Francisco orator and anarchist and so on. He'll later blow up a church in the 1920s, so there was a kind of theory that maybe he might have been responsible, but that's been sort of squashed as well. There was an anarchist who was very famous at the time by the name of Luigi Galliani, who was an Italian, who had come to the United States and had all kinds of followers in the United States. He remained very coy, even in his last days. He was deported from the United States, actually questioned in Boston Harbor before he left, not far from here. And the Bureau of Investigation asked him all kinds of questions if he knew anything, and he just remained very coy and just denied Mooney's guilt when he was deported. There were a couple of books that came out, and this is another image just of the parade to as we kind of think about the whodunit question. There were a couple of books that came out in the 1960s, one by Richard Frost, another by Kurt Gentry, and they both advanced the kind of German sabotage theory. In other words, that the Germans during war, right, had hoped actually to create an explosion, on the waterfront in San Francisco. They were going to blow up some munitions and these kinds of things. And so this was part of a broader plot by the Germans to create this kind of disorder in the United States. So that's another theory. That's a very attractive hypothesis for some folks. And then there's a very recent book about Alexander Berkman and Emma Goldman called Sasha and Emma. That was her nickname. Sasha was his nickname. That they somehow had a role in all of this, perhaps, or possibly, and more likely, that group Volanta that I was talking about, that earlier anarchist group in San Francisco, maybe they had something to do with it. But all of it is kind of speculation. I think any of this kind of certainty about the perpetrator is kind of eager, having looked at all of the sources. And now, as the 100-year anniversary has kind of come and gone of the attack, the only consensus seems to be that there isn't consensus. And the other consensus is that clearly Mooney and Billings did not plant that bomb. But perhaps the whodunit question is not as significant as this broader story of why this matters. As I kind of outlined in my 3 parts for you today, what this event kind of tells us. The San Francisco bombing, where it became known as the Mooney case, the Preparedness Day bombing, stands as, I think, a really underexplored and underappreciated moment in American history. It's this high point for American radicalism between Haymarket and maybe the 1920s or the LA Times bombing in the 1910s, something like this, all the way to Sacco and Vanzetti, certainly in 1920. The Preparedness Day bombing was not the first, nor was it the last moment of radicalism in U.S. history. But I think it gives us a valuable lens into this much broader story. I'll say this too. I think the bombings and the attacks also give us, during this period, some ominous and intimate parallels with other and more recent acts of domestic terrorism. For example, the Atlanta Olympics in 1996, or, when I was researching this very ominously, the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. Shrouded in this debate were questions of loyalty, anti-immigrant attitudes, this kind of rich-poor gap that seemed to be exacerbated in the American experience, and this fear of radicalism that could have, of course, disastrous results. Well, as I mentioned, 100 years later, the anniversary has come and gone. It happened this past summer of the bombing. Today, San Francisco residents and probably even more tourists walk by the bombing site, not really kind of appreciating or maybe not taking notice of this important site. And why would they? There's no plaque, there's no memorial, there's nothing there that draws our attention to that moment. But I think this moment stands as one of the most important reminders of this turbulent relationship about labor and radicalism and immigrants and war during the late 19th and the early 20th century. So I'll stop there and answer any questions. Do you have questions for me? Surely you must. What are you left wondering about? We've got a few minutes. If not, I'll stick around and answer questions. But if you've got a question. Yeah, Jenna.
So they really have no idea who did it?
I wish, this is one of my great, I wish I could tell you. But as I mentioned at the end, there are many hypotheses, and there's no definitive evidence. So, Jenna, let this be a lesson to you. You can write a book about this, and you can come up and research this and find out who did it. But we don't know. And it probably doesn't surprise you, right? Espionage and what we might consider sabotage and those kinds of things. It's not like whoever was responsible, whether they were anarchists or labor folks, they certainly weren't going to telegraph that. They thought they had the 5 people, but then they started to doctor the evidence and so on. They found bomb-making materials and so on, and then they find out, well, it's not really bomb-making materials, but they were convinced it was. So nobody really knows is the short answer. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
What happened to the district attorney?
Interesting question. He ran for office and actually won in California, and then there was a recall election against him. And that failed. So he became a prominent citizen in California. And so he had his own kind of political ambitions. And clearly he could kind of serve as the kind of candidate of business interests. And of course, labor very much opposed him as a public official for sure. But he got his wish, Charles Fickert, for sure. And survived a recall election as well. So, good question. Other questions? Thanks, Molly. Yeah, Joey.
Did anything happen to the police department that arrested the 5 suspects and then jailed?
No, it's a great question. No. Police work functions in such a different way then that there wasn't like a censure, boy, you really got this one wrong, or, we're going to fire the chief of police. And in fact, Fickert and others are great examples that this doesn't affect them at all. They continue their careers and run for other offices and become judges and all of these kinds of things. And so the short answer is no. There wasn't any, formal. We would think now there'd be an investigation of the police, right? But just police work, when I started digging into all of this, just functioned very differently at the time. And again, you also had that kind of Pinkerton element as well, which was kind of acting kind of quasi-independently and so on. It was a very different time for police work. Good question. These are all good questions. I think we're out of time, but I will see.